Oh, hello, come in. I'm away in, as my mother would say. Good to see you. It's been a little while. We're slightly tidier than we might have been otherwise, or at least there's more floor visible because I had to tidy the room up for a photographer who came for an article in a magazine called Christianity Today. Anyway, as you know, I've been away, among other places, in Ulster, and was really struck listening to folk speaking there by the similarities between what's called Ulster Scots and quite a lot of the phrases I would have from my mother, who, as well as speaking English and received pronunciation, did have quite a lot of Scots in her. Now, Scots, of course, isn't simply English spoken with a Scottish accent. It used to be thought of as a distinct dialect, but it's now written about as a distinct language. It comes out of some similar roots. It comes out of the language that was spoken in Northumbria, and that has the same roots back in, Germanic as the language is spoken in Wessex or whatever, but distinct. There's a lot of its own vocabulary and pronunciation and some different grammar too. The scholars tell us that Scots, in that sense, sometimes called Braid Scots, sometimes called Lowland, probably bears the same relation to English as, say, Danish does to Norwegian. But anyway, it used to be spoken much more broadly. My mother had it. So I was leafing through this book, which had been on my shelves for a while, and it's an interesting anthology. It's a book of 20th century Scots verse. Now, you might, at first blush, think that meant that it was 20th century poetry written in Scotland. But it says that to begin with, no poems in English are included. It's Scots in that earlier sense of Scots. Now, you'll all know some Scots, and Scots, for a while, was, of course, it was the language of poets like, the Scottish Chaucerians, poets like Henryson, and it was the kind of language which, in fact, James VI and First of Scotland would speak. But gradually, English, particularly began to supplant it, and it had a curious fate. It, on the one hand, remained the language, as it were, of the peasantry, of the crofters, of the people in the Lowlands, as they were called, particularly, and the sort of rising middle classes, with their university educations, had it sort of trained out of them. But it was also a literary language. So many poems, so many great ballads were written. And of course, the great figure who could use English perfectly well, doubtless with a Scots accent, but could write in Scots, in Lowland, as it was called, was Robert Burns. And many people know his poems that are just in English, like "My love is like a red, red rose that sweetly blooms in June." But everybody knows "For auld lang syne, my Jo, for auld lang syne, we'll tak a cup of kindness yet for the sake of auld lang syne." And that's full of these dialect or distinctly Scots words. So there was a kind of literary Scots. And at various points, it's having a bit of a revival now, although it's still on the list of endangered languages. But it had a bit of a literary revival in the early 20th century, and that's what this book celebrates. And it's drawn from various poets who had already published poems in their own collections, and this was published in 1925, so it's the first quarter of the 20th century. So I'm leafing through it, and suddenly I realise, which I didn't know, I don't think I'd grasped this, that one of the poems in here is by my grandmother, who was a good poet and published 2 volumes of poetry. I may, in fact, I think on another time when you called, I read to you from her Legendary of St Mungo, which is up there, the Legendary of St Mungo, a wonderful set of poems about St Kentigern, or Mungo as he was known, St Mungo, the patron saint of Glasgow, and St Columba from Iona. Anyway, my grandmother also published a set of poems called The Shipmakers and Other Verses, which you can tell just from the title is written in English. But she had a command of Scots. And lo and behold, here in this, if you can have a little look at this, here in this book is a poem called A Gangrel Lullaby, gangrel being Scots for a vagabond or a traveller. And as I read it, you'll see immediately as you look along it that it's in Scots. Scots is close enough to English that you can sort of get the gist of it, but there's lots of words that you don't know. But the second sort of sharp, tender shock for me was when I read the opening. Let me just read you the opening, which is a kind of chorus. It's a lullaby. It's as it turns out, a vagrant woman, and her husband is there too. It's a family on the road in bad weather, seeking shelter in the woods, and the mother is crooning to her child. But it begins, shoo, shoo, we a wee shuggy shoo, build it, we'll hap it, we'll fast sleep new, mothers in doughty, mothers we do, red-headed laddie, my own cushy shoo, cushy do. Well, I suddenly remembered, I probably can't remember, that my mother sang that to me as a cradle song. She had a version with shugity, wee shuggy shoo. She'd jiggle me about as she did it. And in fact, when my children were little and their granny was visiting, she used a croon like that. But here was a whole poem, and I thought I'd have a go at reading it to you. I mean, obviously, I don't have that half of my inheritance. I can't properly speak Scots or Lowland, but I heard my mother often enough doing it and reading poetry in it, at Burns amongst others. But I was thrilled to discover that I knew she was a well-respected poet, my grandmother, but to find her anthologized like this. Anyway, I thought I'd give you a taste of it, because when I first read it just earlier on today, I thought, beginning to think it was, this is just a lovely, if you like, sentimental little lullaby. But I know my grandmother was deeply concerned for the plight of the poor and actually worked with the refugees that came over immediately in the wake of the First World War and the invasions of, Belgium and Holland and so on, and taught refugee children. And she had a real feel, I think, for the plight of the poor and the homeless. Anyway, I'll give you a bit of a taste of it. So, shoo, shoo, we a wee shuggy shoo, build it, we'll hap it, we'll fast sleep new. Mothers in doughty, mothers we do. Red-headed laddie, my own cushy do. Well, you can hear red-headed laddie, can't you? Red-headed lad. And build it, we'll hap it well. That means sheltered well, wrapped well. Fast sleep new, fast fall asleep now. And then she sets the scene in the lullaby. It's got a beautiful sort of jiggling rhythm that you can imagine the mother rocking her baby to. Days fading fast from the buchs on the bens, mist wraiths hang white o' the brews o' the bens, dreeping wi' rain o' the dowie grey glens, blattered with wheat o' the lane lanksome glens. Tail to we, weary are we, weary and wat for the nichts on our we, weary and wat how we tramp it all day. Nae bonny sun glints red gold on the bens, the mist like a ghaist drifts through murk o' the glens. You can hear the weather in the words, I hope, and the mist wraiths hanging white. And it's dreeping with rain, and this wonderful Scots word, which I have in fact had heard my mother use, blattered with wheat o' the lane lanksome glens. Blattered means hit, harried, battered. It's the rain coming down. Wheat is just the wetness, and lane lanksome glens, the lonesome glens. They're in the glen. Tagled means caught up, delayed, constrained. You can feel the sense of word of tangled. Tagled are we, weary and wat for the nicks on our we. So there they are. And then she finds a little place dry in the firwood. It's in the darkling wee firwood. It's dry, ma do, warm, ma do. By the bricht fire, laddie, fall asleep new. Trees shack the wheat frae the dark boughs aboon us. No a wee breeze frae the west comes to croon us. Saft to your rest, soon to your rest. Red-headed lad with his ain minnie's breast. Bairn of the bield on his ain minnie's breast. She by her man in her tent ticht and true. So there they are. they're in the dry bit of fir wood, and I love this thing about the trees shack the wheat for the dark boozer booners, the trees shaking off the wet from the dark boughs above us, then the little breeze. And then you just realise she's not on her own, at least. She's got the bairn at her breast, and Minnie's an affectionate word for mother. He's in Minnie's breast. And she's by her man in her tent, ticht and true, tried and true. Brown earth with pine needles make gran halesome beds. Sweet, sweet is the scent that the bonny bark sheds. The lich smoking's greyly aboon her tent moo. Shoo, shoo, a wee shuggy shoo. We'll hap it, we'll build it, we'll snuggle it and shield it, frae the cold and the murk, for the rain and the dew. Red thicket laddie, we cruddle and do. Now not a wah, not a wah, not a wah new. That's wonderful. And then these words, we get again, hap it and build it, sheltered and shielded is what it means. And she gives it again, snuggled, she adds, and shield it. From the cold and the murk, from the rain and the dew. Warm shall ye sleep, snuggle in, creep in, warm shall ye sleep, and your ain Minnie's plaid. Till so she's wearing the plaid, and she's got the babe snuggled up under her breast in the plaid. And then it goes on, in the final verse, the mother's obviously still awake, and the babe's sleeping, and she watches the moon rise. Roon yellow moon rises up o'er the bens. The wind herds the mist wraiths up o'er the bens, shaking the wheat frae the woods and the glens, frae craps and frae flowers in the fields of the glens. So it's wonderful. Metaphor, the wind is herding the wraiths of mist, as though you would herd sheep. It's herding the mist away up o'er the bens, the hills, and shaking the wet from the woods over the crops and the flowers and the fields of the glens. And then it ends, big waters roar wildly the glens frae the bens, cozy your bed and canty your wee, cradled and coothie my doo and my dear on my breast and my dear lying near. Round yellow moon rises up o'er the bens, winds heard in the mist wraiths up out to the glens. The wind's almost become this shepherd. So it's so full of good words, all this, snuggled and thicket and blattered and tagled. You feel that we've lost some of the richness, if you like, of our potential vocabularies when these very strong semi-dialects, semi-distinct languages get marginalised. And so many people, including my grandmother, were keeping them going and using them, as many are now. And I was really delighted to discover that she'd been noted for that. And in this anthology, which was published in both Glasgow and London and was very much part of that literary revival of Scots, that my grandmother, from whose descent I suppose I get the poetic gene, was part of that. Anyway, I thought you'd enjoy it, and really, to use another Scots Lowland word, it can't really be enjoyed without a dram. So, cheers and sláinte.